All right, Amber, you go.
All right, welcome everyone. We are going to start with Katie because she has to leave us in about 5 minutes exactly. Because she has a very good excuse. She has to get across town and across the river during UN week to interview Mika Brzezinski at the 92nd Street Y at 7:15 sharp.
Yeah.
Katie.
So hi everyone. I'm so sorry that I have to duck out, but people paid and bought tickets, and I can't not show up. You know what I'm saying?
It's been a day, Katie.
Yeah. Oh my God. First of all, hi everyone. This is so stressful. The whole day, my stomach has been in knots. It's been so incredibly emotional. I covered the Anita Hill hearings back in 1991, and it's like deja vu all over again. And I don't know, it's so upsetting. I feel like I need like a big bottle of wine, a big cheese pizza, and a lot of my friends to talk, because I'm still processing it, honestly.
So no one's asking you to pass judgment on Dr. Ford or Judge Kavanaugh right now, or their testimony, but talk about how you're feeling. So many years later, after covering Anita Hill, what emotionally, especially after the year we've had, and all these stories that have been told, and all the justice that we've seen come to fruition?
I mean, I feel like we still have so much educating to do. There's so much misunderstanding about just sexual assault, trauma, misogyny. I just kind of turned that into a French word, sorry, misogyny. And sort of the culture that exists that has for so long, in very subtle and insidious ways, marginalized women. And I just hope that we can move forward and have a constructive conversation. I was very moved by Dr. Ford and her testimony. I found her to be exceedingly credible. I have to say, I also got emotional during Judge Kavanaugh's testimony, if I had to be honest, hearing the impact that this has had on his children. And also, I have a lot of friends. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area who know him well and say incredible things about him. I think that, I think it's really hard because we have two very different versions of events. But I found her account to be very, very credible. And I think maybe he cannot give an inch and has to be very steadfast in his denial of this ever happening. Just P.S., I think, and I'm sure the rest of the panel has many more intelligent things to say about this, but the process was just outrageous. Yeah. The fact that they jammed this through, there wasn't an FBI investigation. I also have a problem with the way Senator Feinstein honestly handled it. And I think what Anita Hill wrote a couple of weeks ago, I think it was actually after this surfaced, was, there should be a full FBI investigation. It should not be rushed. And quite frankly, I think that Dr. Ford took a page from Anita Hill's playbook when she set down the conditions for her testimony. Yeah. So I think we as a country have a lot to learn. And unfortunately, I think the partisan vitriol actually gets in the way of figuring out how we come together, move forward, and make things better for everyone.
You mentioned, rightly so, that this has almost become a partisan issue, which is terrifying and insane. The title of this panel is Me Too, Now What? How, in your estimation, can we start to bridge that gap? How do we make this a non-partisan issue so people on both sides of the aisle are taking these allegations seriously, and that this doesn't descend into partisan rancor every time there's a credible allegation?
God, I don't know. I really don't. I mean, I think that we have to move constructively. I mean, Amber's working with Time's Up. Tina, I don't know if you're working with Time's Up too. You're working with Time's Up. Oh yeah, you're like in charge or something.
Yeah, she is.
Just a little.
She's literally in charge.
She is Time's Up. Sorry, but clearly, I think that we have to include men in the conversation, and I think we need to make it an inclusive conversation. I understand the anger. Honestly, I'm angry too, but I also think that we have to channel it into trying to move forward in a positive way, trying to acknowledge the problem, to really be actually transparent and take a clear-eyed look at the institutions that are still in place, that are creating these disparities between men and women, and also, I think, making these attitudes still exist. You know, I did a whole hour on gender inequality for National Geographic. I did a series on big thorny social issues. Shameless plug, please watch, you guys. It's on Hulu, and it's called America Inside Out. And one of the things that I think has gotten short shrift in these whole discussions is implicit bias. And you know, it's a real thing. And I think that we have to start thinking more about how we're culturally conditioned to see the world in a certain way. And you know, even I have had to unlearn learned behaviors. You know, I just did a 2-part little podcast on Sarah Palin. I know, is my assistant having a heart attack over there? Anyway, and
she said we have 10 more minutes.
You know, and I realized, you know, I was remembering talking to Cindy McCain when Sarah Palin was selected by John McCain, and I remember saying to her, gosh, Mrs. McCain, how is Sarah Palin going to manage being vice president with all those children, and she also has a special needs son? And Cindy McCain, to her credit, looked at me like I had 2 heads, like, what is wrong with you? But I realized, you know, here I was kind of adhering to gender stereotypes, and that was me. Like, I was the anchor of the CBS Evening News at the time. I mean, that's so ridiculous, but I think we always kind of need to check ourselves. And I think if we can help other people kind of understand how their attitudes are formed by these images we're accosted by on a daily basis through mass media and the culture and advertising and programming and gender roles, I think, I don't know, maybe that's too idealistic, but I think it could be exceedingly helpful. But I'd like to hear what these other smart ladies have to say.
Stick around.
Even though I have to leave. Can I hear a couple of quick things? Beth, can I stay for 2 more minutes?
2 more minutes. I have one question, one last question then. You mentioned these institutions, and one institution that I feel has been an enabler of so much of the abuse that the Times and other institutions have written about in recent years is the media industry. Yeah. And you were right in the center of that. How do you explain what happened at NBC? How do you explain that so much was known by so many, and yet it did take so long for some of these allegations to come to light?
You know, I have to challenge your question that so much was known by so many. I really don't think that was true. I think that certain behaviors at NBC and CBS and the New York Times and other news outlets were not necessarily known in a widespread way. Certainly in my case, it was not anything I was aware of. And, you know, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about how people work when they work on TV shows together. Matt Lauer was an incredible work partner for me. He was generous and kind and supportive of me. What he did after the show, what he did in his spare time, you know, we didn't all go out to lunch. We all did our work and really had separate lives after the show, was something I just simply wasn't aware of. And I still don't know all the details of what happened, but clearly there was an abuse of power there, and clearly it was enough to terminate him. But I think that in my view, a lot of these institutions, these media companies, they just didn't take this seriously for so long. It was tolerated, or if people, you know, there were not clear-cut rules, I think, and there was a lot of fraternization between bosses and people who work for those bosses, and people might have known that, and I think that set a tone that, oh, this is okay. It's sort of set a permissive tone. And so I think actually really the examination I hope that's going on at all these networks is an acknowledgement of a problem and really clear steps about how they're going to fix it. I'm afraid when there are internal investigations, I don't have a ton of faith in those. It'll be interesting to see what the law firms find out, you know, conclude about the culture at CBS News, which was a very difficult one for me personally. I think acknowledging that and then having clear-cut steps on how they're going to fix things, put more women in leadership positions. You know, all these networks are run by men. All the evening newscasts are done by men. You know, all these, I mean, most of the key decision-making roles are still men. And I can't, you know, it's like, seriously? Let's change that. And I really think the more I study this, the more panels I'm on, the more panels I moderate, it really starts at the top. And it's got to be a really, serious commitment to bringing more women up into leadership positions, to training more so the pipeline is more vibrant, to even having quotas, but not real quotas, but people. There's a 30% club that was started in Great Britain in 2010, but a real commitment to integrating the workforce, bringing not only women up, but women of color up, and having the diversity we need in a newsroom so that the stories we cover reflect the country, not just a particular segment of the population. And with that, I gotta go.
Thank you, Katie.
Bye, Katie.
Okay. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
I do want to say a few remarks just to frame this discussion a little bit. It's been a historic year for women who are having their voices heard and their stories told like never before. And this is a historic day. I think we all know that. And it's extraordinary to be here with you all on this day. But while so much has changed over the last few years, on a day like this, it feels like, not much has changed at all. And so I'm thrilled to have this panel with us at the conclusion of this incredible conference. And though I'm up here, I really represent my colleagues at the Times. I worked with some of my colleagues who you got to know over the last few days, Meredith, Rebecca, Dorothea, Jess, to help inform me and these questions. Amber, I'd like to start with you. And let's start with today. You were able to watch some of Dr. Ford's testimony, some of Judge Kavanaugh's testimony. Again, I just can't help but wonder what your visceral reaction was after all the work you've done over the last year to see this spectacle unfold.
Well, my first reaction was I watched most of her testimony, and then I had to turn his testimony off because I have been abused by a person who then, did not remember many years later and contacted me out of the blue to say that I never choked you, that never happened. So I think for a lot of people, a lot of survivors of experiences like that, this is a deeply traumatic and difficult day. I think I was most, it's interesting, Katie's talking about the gender bias, and I was most struck by how about the emotional double standards presented today, and in watching, Brett Kavanaugh be able to vividly, emotionally express himself both with anger and in tears. And I was reminded of the way in which Anita Hill needed to behave and the way in which Dr. Ford needed to behave, almost holding that feeling in and holding those emotions in. And to me, that's just the paradigm of the inequality. It's like a larger look at how things are so off balance, and the way in which we say, emotional intelligence is not a form of intelligence. Only rational thought matters. Emotional thought does not matter. And to me, I looked at it and I said, we're having a total repetition of last year. It's happening all over again, just like it did at the end of 2017. Here we are again with women having to come out and tell stories, and they're online and saying, this has happened to me. And I have been told that it didn't happen, and that I don't remember it, or that I'm remembering it incorrectly. So it's a pretty powerful day, and also just a pretty fucking upsetting day.
Yeah. Tina, Katie acknowledged that she found Judge Kavanaugh's testimony compelling in some ways. And I wonder, as a lawyer, how would you assess what you saw?
So recognizing I've been in and out here and doing it. But I think, so as a lawyer, and I think some of the senators summarized it, when you look at Dr. Ford's testimony, not only was she composed and vivid today, right? So she was honest about what she could remember and honest about what she could not, but vivid in her recollection about what she could. And it was a particularly compelling moment, both when she said she was 100% sure it was Brett Kavanaugh, and when asked by Senator Feinstein, how do you know? She said, in the same way I know that I'm sitting here looking at you, right? My eyes are seeing you, is sending the message to my brain that this is you. And consistent with her prior, so they've lined up all the prior statements, notwithstanding what I assume was the attempt by the prosecutor to find inconsistencies in those statements. there really aren't any, and consistent going back many years. And there is no demonstrated motivation other than what she testified to her civic responsibility to come forward now. You contrast that with what I see from Judge Kavanaugh, and you recognize I'm a partisan, but what you see, I'm trying to dispassionately analyze this, and he has not been consistent. His statement has varied from "I never drank" to "I did drink and throw up," and Ralph means throwing up. It has, you look back to what he testified about the Senate documents, which was also not consistent, nor apparently truthful. And in contrast to her very consistent pattern, he does not have a very consistent pattern. So if you step back for a moment just to analyze dispassionately what you have in front of you and take the politics out, if we were able to do that, that's what you would have.
It's tempting to spend this last panel just talking about what was on television today, but of course we're here to talk about much more than that. And the Me Too movement is just that. It's a movement. And so much, I have to say, of the coverage, including today, focuses on either accusers who are powerful, well-known figures, and oftentimes the women who are coming forward with these allegations that get the most press are also privileged, often white. Saru, you work with an entirely different group of individuals, restaurant workers for the most part, who face these challenges every day, who are the subject of tremendous amount of abuse. Could you talk to us briefly about your work and explain to us how the Me Too movement has affected this community that you work so closely with?
Well, it's interesting. I also watched today, and I couldn't help thinking throughout it about 15-year-olds, 15-year-old girls. In her case, a 15-year-old girl who regularly went to the country club, who had a very privileged life, and who got sexually assaulted, got nearly raped. And I couldn't help but think about the literally millions of 15-year-olds that I represent who are assaulted on a daily basis at work, and nobody ever knows about it. In fact, they don't even use the words assault or even harassment for what they experience on a daily basis. So I'm not talking about a sliver of the American population. I'm talking about the nation's largest private sector employer. We're about to hit the 13 million worker mark in the restaurant industry. 1 in 11 American workers currently works in restaurants. 1 in 11 American women currently works in restaurants. It is one of the largest private sector employers of women in the United States, and it is the absolute bottom of the barrel, lowest paying. And that is because of a trade lobby called the National Restaurant Association, which we call the other NRA. It represents the chains, the IHOPs, the Applebee's. It's maintained a wage since slavery, since emancipation, of $2.13 an hour, which is the current federal minimum wage for tipped workers in the United States. 43 states, including New York State, continue this sub-minimum wage system, paying a mostly female workforce. 70% of tipped workers in the United States are women, paying women in America a sub-minimum wage. And I shouldn't have to say anything more to you except that the largest private sector employer of women in the United States pays a wage of $2.13 an hour. And so we are talking about how the other half lives and what it means to live off a $2 and $3 wage in 43 states, including New York, is that when you live off of tips, because that's what a sub-minimum wage means. It means your wage is so low, it goes to taxes. You're living mostly off of tips. You must tolerate whatever a customer does to you, however they touch you or treat you or talk to you. The customer is always right. They pay your bills. The customer has the power, because the customer is always right, to grab you, to harass you, to even assault you, and you've got to put up with it. No, you've got to encourage it. Our research shows managers tell women, go dress more sexy, show more cleavage, wear tighter clothing. Now, this is the first job for 1 in 2 American women. I'm sure many of you how many of you worked in restaurants at some point in your life?
Wow.
Look around the room. This is the first job for half of American women, a job in which they are told, go out, dress more sexy, show more cleavage, wear tighter clothing in order to make more money in tips. And so we've been interviewing celebrities and judges and senators who say, I've been sexually harassed more recently in my current job, but I didn't do anything about it because it was never as bad as it was when I was a young woman working in restaurants, which means our industry sets the standard. What has Me Too and Time's Up done for us? You know, I was at the Golden Globes with many others as part of the Time's Up action with Tarana Burke and others. And that resulted in Governor Cuomo here in New York saying, yes, I will eliminate the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers in New York, but he hasn't done it yet. And Amber was one of 15 actresses who signed on to a letter encouraging him to do it. We're waiting for him to do it, and if he doesn't, there are going to be real consequences, which I think needs to be the next step of Me Too and Time's Up. You know, maybe you haven't seen it, but millions of restaurant workers have been standing up across America, winning. We won the elimination of the sub-minimum wage in Washington, D.C. We raised the wage in June from $3 in our nation's capital to $15 an hour. Woo. In Michigan, nobody even knows, but the Michigan Republicans actually, out of fear that we would drive people to the polls, tripled the wages of waitresses in Michigan 3 weeks ago in the state of Michigan from $3 to $12 an hour. Huge victories, huge advances because of Me Too and Time's Up. Nobody knows, nobody's recording it. Nobody's recording the pushback that these women are experiencing. Christine Blasey Ford has had it really bad. Our waitress members are getting death threats on a daily basis from men saying, you're lying, there's no sexual harassment, you can live on $3, you make enough money in tips. On a daily basis, they're being screamed at and yelled at, and it's because we're winning, it's because we're advancing, and there's tremendous fear of change. But time is up.
Yeah. And we've sued. So the Time's Up, you know, just my shameless plug is for the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, which, you know, National Women's Law Center, you can go to nwlc.org if you need help, you want to volunteer as a lawyer, or also importantly, if you want to contribute, because we are contributing to the class action lawsuit that the Legal Defense Fund just filed on behalf of fast food workers who have been sexually harassed on the job, including a 15-year-old.
Yeah.
One of our plaintiffs is a 15-year-old girl. Could be any one of our daughters who's working on a Sunday at McDonald's and just got continuously harassed.
And the saddest part is when you talk to these young women, so we did a survey many years ago, surveyed 10,000 workers across America. Only 1 in 5 when we asked said they had been sexually harassed. We had to work to change the questions to say, have you experienced sexual behavior in the restaurant that is scary or unwanted? And then 90% of both men and women said yes. So the fact is, most of these 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, our daughters, even adult women, do not actually call what they are experiencing sexual harassment. There's such a fine line between doing your job, pleasing the customer, pleasing your boss, and experiencing something totally illegal and unethical.
This is a solutions-oriented conference, and I heard one practical step that you all are taking. You're suing people. That's excellent.
Well,
what are others? Is my next question.
Okay, another
How do we
practical
harness
step.
this and harness this energy and take it into the world? Give me concrete examples of what we can expect over the next year that is going to change not just the conversation, but laws, change behaviors.
Well, also the culture. I mean, I think it's about the systems that are in place, and you talk about that, these systems of power that enable the behavior to happen. And already, if you look at the three of us sitting right here, I never knew Tina before, I never knew Saru before, I never knew Monica Ramirez, I didn't know all of the incredible women that are doing the work that they are now before this movement happened. What it did is it brought different women and some men too together from different industries and said, we want to create something so that no woman or man or non-binary person ever has to say Me Too again. That's the point of Time's Up, is to put those things into action and to create actionable change. And so for me, the proactiveness is the force, is the task force of women and men and anyone who wants to come along with the ride to say, we're not asking you for these permissions to change things anymore, we are forcing them to change. And you are either coming along with us or you're extinct. It's that simple.
You know,
So I can give you, I mean, a few. This is one of the things I do. But in addition to Time's Up, in my law practice at Buckley Sandler, as we started a workplace culture compliance practice. I swear to God, we started it 3 weeks before the first Harvey Weinstein article. But good, the timing was, unforeseen. But one of the couple of things really practical that I'm working with the companies that are my clients. First of all, and it was interesting to hear, Kate, on the rules being unclear, and we know actually the law is really limited.
Yeah.
The statute of limitations is too short, but more importantly, the kind of conduct that's really illegal is the bar is really low. There's a lot of bad behavior that's toxic, that is harassing, that destroys workplace culture. That's not illegal. The equal opportunity bully, as I call him, who throws a phone at the head of everyone, not based on your sex or your race, not illegal. Flip side, it's also not required under the law that you protect a fellow worker who comes forward. The bystander who steps up, if that bystander gets retaliated against, there's no protection for them right now under the law. So one of the things we have to do, new rules, is we can't go by just the legal limits of the law. And too much of our sexual harassment law and training, and we've all been through the same training for the last 30 years, everybody's done it, is it's all been about legal limits in liability compliance training instead of training about the culture. We have the companies who are doing it right and are thinking about this are thinking about the values that they want to have in the workplace. And it goes beyond your employment lawyer saying, oh, no, don't protect bystanders because you're not required to. Yes, we want our workers to stand up for each other. So I'm going to set that as a value for my company, and I'm going to protect you. And if it exposes me to a little more liability, that's okay, because I'm going to invest in my workers and invest in the culture. And then we have to train to those values. And we have to have tone at the top. And that's been said a lot here today, is that the CEO and the C-suite have to own these issues, and we can't just, have our just HR department and our employee, relations people be the ones toiling at this. It's got to be owned at the top, like every important issue in a company is owned at the top. Every important investment, every important technology you want to expand into. Your people in this economy is your differentiator in your business. You're only going to succeed if you have the best talent, and in a tight talent market, you better have the right culture. And the ones that get this right are the companies that will still be standing a decade from now.
Yeah.
Saru.
We've been meeting, all of us low-wage sectors, women of color that have been part of Me Too and Time's Up, myself, Monica from the Farm Workers Movement, I Jump the Domestic Workers, Tarana. And there's two things that really we feel like as women of color and women who represent underrepresented groups really think about solutions going forward. They have to be structural, and they have to be, believe it or not, redemptive or restorative. And so let me just talk quickly about these two. In terms of structural, that means policy change that is not just about individual companies changing their HR systems or changing their culture, but policy change. In our case, it's so ridiculously backwards that we should just be fighting to earn the minimum wage. All we're asking for is to earn the frickin' minimum wage. And what we find is that when you pay, the 7 states that require the restaurant industry to pay the minimum wage actually have 1/2 the rate of sexual harassment as New York and the 43 states with lower wages for tipped workers. Because it turns out when you pay women an actual wage, they don't have to actually put up with all the harassment from the customers to earn their income in tips. They can count on a wage from their boss. It is the perfect epitome example of how power is at the root of sexual harassment and equal pay is at the root of sexual harassment. The fact that women's power and pay has everything to do with their ability to reject harassment, whether it's in the restaurant industry or any industry. So structural change. And companies can be a part of structural change. We have 700 restaurant companies from Danny Meyer and Tom Colicchio down to Alice Waters and small mom and pop restaurants around the country that have signed on to, yes, we need a different way of doing business. We call them the high road to profitability. So promoting restaurants that are signing on to policy change, not just change in their own companies, but policy change, and then encouraging other companies to also do the same. That's the structural change we need. On the restorative and redemptive side, I think Tarana was supposed to be with us today, but had to go be part of the Kavanaugh hearings, Tarana Burke, who founded Me Too. And as some of you may know, her original concept was always about restorative justice, always about redemption, because in communities of color, we do not think it's actually a good solution to criminalize men or anybody in our communities. Criminalization doesn't actually help. And so what restorative or redemptive solutions mean is actually bringing men into community in getting rid of the power dynamic in a way in which you can actually resolve issues in the community and actually move forward. So in the case of the restaurant industry, as a quick example, we've been doing this for years with companies where a Mario Batali or another kind of employer does something very wrong. We hold them accountable, but we allow them to move from the low road to the high road. We teach them and train them with workers guiding the way, women guiding the way of how things can be different. Anybody can reform. Nobody's perfect or evil, and the solutions have to be structural and restorative.
Thank you. We're going to go to questions in just a minute, but I have to ask, there is a backlash against the Me Too movement that I don't even know if we can say. Well, how can you say that?
Take it right out of your mouth. There's not. I'm just going to take it out and put it over here.
So I would counter by saying, what did we see on Capitol Hill today?
That's not a backlash. That is a continuation of the problem. There's nothing about that that's a backlash. A backlash has been created as like a rouge to sort of distract everyone and say, oh, look at this problem over here. And I think all we're seeing today is a continuation of the problem that remains of the system that's in place when you, and the problem, the pervasive problem of having a lack of representation in positions of power. One of the other things, I think there was I had read somewhere, and maybe even just learning through Time's Up, that if you have more women in positions of power, especially women of color, then also sexual harassment and assault goes down.
Yes.
So no matter what, we're looking at the problem in the larger sense is the lack of representation that is creating these problems. And what you're seeing today is like this phantom ghost of the before Me Too movement. And you're seeing this sort of scary figure of what every single one of us goes through every day. It is a representation of the systematic problem the country still faces, of all of the women, of all of the workers Saru just talked about. You know, Dr. Ford is the larger, sort of, unfortunately, celebrity model of that in this moment, of what every woman is going through. I saw today, it was either Grassley or I think it was Lindsey Graham who was saying, you know, as a warning on one of their breaks, he was like, if the Democrats, if this is how they're going to go forward with their nominees, then just you wait until we, just see what happens to your nominees. And I was like, Dr. Ford is not a part of your two-party bullshit. She's not a politician. She's a woman, just like you, just like me, just like the three of us up here on stage. She doesn't care about Democrat or Republican. She is telling a story she didn't even want to tell in the first place. She was forced to tell. And for them to politicize it, they are the ones that are doing that, not us. We are just speaking. That's all we're doing. And I think that the more we do that, the more we can push through the pain of it, the more that we can keep the focus on it and take away from talks of witch hunts and backlashes and leave those to the voices of Woody Allen and somebody else. And just keep talking about the proactive work we have to do.
I will come to your defense a little bit. Oh, sorry, did you want to?
No, I just wanted to say thank you, Amber, and recognize that we do need to go to questions.
Oh, okay.
Questions. Here, I saw this one in the front first. No, there's a mic.
You are all so fabulous. I've waited all day to hear you, so thank you
This
for
is the stalwarts. You've got to the end here.
just so powerful words. And my question is, the Me Too movement for myself and for all the women I know has been so empowering, and I'm sure in your lives as well. And I'm curious about what you think is the root of that. Why has this caused so many women to come together?
I think, well, first of all, I have to give a lot of credit to the women of Hollywood. I mean, because I've thought a lot about why is this moment different than 27 years ago, when we all kind of sat in our living rooms and watched this incredibly brave, Anita Hill, sit there. And I think what's different is, as wonderful as she was, we didn't know her. We didn't know her before. We didn't know her. But when Amber steps up, right, or Ashley Judd steps up, or Natalie Portman steps up, we are such a celebrity-driven culture. We think we're your best friend, even though we only just met this year, right?
You're my best friend, Tina.
But we're watching. We have watched these celebrities, and in our culture, we think we know them. So when they spoke, and that is what the courage of the women of Hollywood was. When they spoke, it really touched us, I think, in a different way. And then, 27 years ago, if it had happened to you, what would you do? You would tell 10 friends, and it would stop there. So it happening in a social media age where, because of Tirana and hashtag #MeToo, you posted it there and then millions saw it. Both it gave voice to your story and it gave support to one another. And then the third thing I will say is, again, to give a nod to the women who started Time's Up, is, as you heard, from America last night, the story of the farm workers women. I mean, there was an amazing thing that doesn't always happen in movements, where the people with privilege where the people without privilege actually first. Let's acknowledge first that the people without privilege are the ones who reached up to the women of Hollywood to say, we're farm worker women who deal with this every day, but we see you, and we want to stand with you and support you. They didn't ask for anything. They just said, we're with you. And to their credit, then the women of Hollywood responded back and says, we see you too, and we want to use our privilege to help you. So the objective of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is to primarily serve low-income women. 2/3 of the 3,500 people who've come to us are low-income workers, which is what we wanted. And that, I think those three things have propelled a moment that is very unlike what we've seen before in the past.
And it was Tarana Burke who said, it's either truth or, I believe she said, truth is contagious. And I feel like that to me is exactly what happened with everything and why it happened, is that we were all waiting, and then suddenly here's a group of women that are speaking publicly, so now we're going to speak publicly. And I know, speaking as a privileged actress, a woman who has a lot of exposure and access to things, that it felt, I've always been an activist, but this felt like a place in which I could put my worth and my work to action, and that I could be connected with women that I would normally never get to meet and say, we're going to do something for the greater good, not just for the one cause that I'm into. We're going to make this about everybody. It's going to be fully inclusive.
I would add that women, low-wage workers have been fighting this issue for decades. We've been working on these issues for decades. And we were here long before Me Too and Time's Up, and I too credit Hollywood for reaching out, standing with us. I also credit Tirana, because when Michelle asked Tirana to go to the Golden Globe, she said, I'm not going to do it alone. Tchen has to come, Saru has to come, Monica has to come. We were all brought together. So it's women standing together across sectors, not just Hollywood, but farm workers, restaurant workers, tech, everybody standing together and saying, enough is enough. And we're all professionals, whether we serve in a restaurant or we act as a waitress or we're a tech CEO. We are all professionals who deserve to be remunerated and valued as the professionals that we are, whether we clean a bathroom or we harvest in a field or we work in a restaurant. We are professionals. The other piece I would say that I see is empowering, especially low-wage women, is people. I will give you a little bit of credit for what you said. Our women are facing some backlash. Our women, the Restaurant Association set up a fake AstroTurf worker organization of white men that follow us around, scream at us, yell at us, send us death threats, say you're lying, there's no sexual harassment, none of us needs a raise, we make enough money in tips. And to Amber's point, they were always there, but the Trump moment has increased the vitriol to a point where they feel entitled to attack us. And the fact that our waitresses are standing up and being re-traumatized over and over and over again and having courage anyway and winning, that's what's so incredible about this moment.
Thank you.
So true.
We unfortunately have to wrap up. I'm happy to say that we have time for drinks after this, which I know many of us could use.
Yes.
And hopefully some of our panelists will be able to stick around and chat. As we wrap up, I'm reminded also of something America said last night, where she said, this isn't the work. And being here together and having these conversations, this is not the work. The work is what happens a week, 2 weeks, 2 months from now, when we're working with our representatives, when we're going into our companies, and when we're speaking with our friends and families. So let's not forget that as we go forward. Now, please welcome back our Deputy Managing Editor, Rebecca Blumenstein. Thank you all. And thank you to our panel.